and welcome to this second session on Teshuva of our series for Elul leading up to Rosh Hashanah and after, which we have called Preparing Our Souls for the High Holy Days. Thank you for joining us. Tonight we're going to be hearing from Rabbi Rachel Bovitz. Before that, let me introduce myself. My name is Herb Levine. I'm a board member of the Center for Contemporary Musar. I serve as its vice chair. The Center for Contemporary Musar was started by senior students of Rabbi Ira Stone several years ago in order to carry on and promote the legacy of Rabbi Stone's Musar teachings. In addition to this webinar series that you're participating in right now, we have a series of classes. There's a Seeds of Musar introductory class, followed by a several semester sequence called Foundations of Musar, and then a several semester culminating experience called Transformations through Musar. And we hope that you will visit our website and check those out for those of you who studied with us before, as there are many of you, know that there are new courses for graduates being planned and that will already up on the website and will soon be available. Thanks again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over now to my teacher and colleague, Rabbi Ira Stone, who will introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Herb, and good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Rabbi Rachel Bovitz. Rabbi Bovitz's Musar journey began in Las Vegas. Thankfully, what happened in Las Vegas didn't stay there, but rather Rachel took our first meeting in Las Vegas and committed herself to being involved and learning and eventually teaching in our program, and really has been one of the prime movers in moving along our curriculum and our organization. She is presently, in addition, her day job, as it were, executive director of the Florence Melton School of Adult Jewish Learning, having previously been its chief strategy officer and a founding director of the LA branch of the Melton School. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the exemplary Jewish adult education programs offered through the Melton School. Rachel has been a professor at American Jewish University. She was the director of millennial engagement at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and began her career in the rabbinate at Temple Aliyah in Woodland Hills, California. She received her BA in Jewish Studies from UCLA and was ordained from the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies. She and her husband and their 3 children live in New York City, and we are thrilled to have her as a teacher in our organization, and I'm sure that you will enjoy the learning with her this evening. So it's my pleasure to present Rabbi Rachel Bovitz.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Stone. It's an honor to teach tonight, and I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to present using a PowerPoint deck, which I'll have the text that I'm going to talk about this evening. I also will promise to pause and take questions throughout the presentation, so please feel free to put questions in the chat box, and one of my 2 chavrutas, Herb, will be fielding questions and sharing those with me. Okay, so we're gonna start. Let me share my screen here. Can everybody see that? Okay, fantastic.
I don't see your screen yet.
Okay.
It says you've started screen sharing. You need to double click on your deck.
It's telling me I'm screen sharing. I wonder.
I can see it.
You can see it.
Okay.
Can other people see it?
Okay, so
Okay, Herb, I think it's you.
it's just me.
It's not me, it's you. Okay.
I'll work on it. Okay,
fantastic. All right, so tonight we're going to be talking about Teshuva, as Rabbi Stone introduced last week in our opening session, we're going to be focusing on, for the next 4 sessions on this line from Untitled Chapter that I have here in the Hebrew, but we're going to look at Teshuva in the English going forward, but Teshuva, Utefila, Utsadaka, Ma'avirin, et Roa HaGazera. So that's the context. And I thought I would first highlight, I know many of you were on last week, but from the notes I took some of the foundational ideas that were shared with us last time that I'm going to be building on in tonight's presentation. So the teaching that Rabbi Stone shared with us last week, the beautiful teaching from the Slonemer Rebbe, really reminds us that this season of Elul, this month that we're starting, reminds us that every year has a destiny, and each of us have our own destiny, and then we obviously have a destiny what we're supposed to be doing in a given year. And in order to realize that, and this is really essential to what we're going to be talking about, I think, in almost every session, is our ability to do cheshbon hanefesh, taking a real accounting of our behavior, of our actions, how we are in the world. And finally, as I said, we're sort of using as our framework the poetry found in the prayer Unatana Tokef that Rabbi Stone encouraged us last week not to read literally, and that's a big theme of how CCM teaches Jewish texts and especially Jewish theology, but to be able to look at this prayer that's had such a powerful role in our history and be able to glean from its poetry important lessons. Tonight we're going to really do that. We're going to delve deep into one word out of the whole beautiful prayer, beautiful and challenging prayer, I would say. So we're going to take the path that he suggested we do. So Rabbi Stone left us with a couple of essential questions that he sort of posed to us who are to follow him that we should explore, and I added one here in the middle. So he wanted us to talk about what does, in my case, Teshuva actually mean. Next week it'll be what does tefillah actually mean, etc. I wanted to add the question of whether we really believe that other people can do tshuva. There's sort of the two, I think on the high holidays, there's those two aspects that are really important, both our own work that we're doing, but also the work of forgiveness and being able to see other people and believe in their goodness. And that's what we're going to focus on in the second part of my presentation. And then he asked a very, I think, challenging question that I'm going to try to answer, which is how does Teshuva transform us? So this will be the beginning of a little beginning to that, of an answer to that question. What I want to do in my presentation is look at some other sources, some of them being real classic sources, also a modern source, about Teshuva, and then look at those sources through the lens that we see text that we understand from the Center for Contemporary Musar. And you'll see what I mean. We're going to start with really the classic source on Teshuva, which comes from the Rambam, the Mishnah Torah, and we're going to read it through our lens, like putting really the theology and philosophy that we've all gained from Rabbi Stone as an overlay into these texts. So in order to do that, I thought it was really important to share with all of you what the definition we hold of sin to be, because Rambam speaks in talking about Teshuva and repentance, the language he speaks about is sin, and so it's important to sort of understand in our context what we mean by sin. So this comes from Rabbi Stone's commentary in Mesilat Yesharim, one of the classic books that we study in our program, really a source text, starting with Salanter, that we've adopted that curriculum in the work that we do. And here, really important, I'm going to just read it. I don't usually read slides, but I'm going to read this one out loud. Sin is the projection of the Yetzer Hara into the world. It's the choice of self-interest at the expense of the other's good when such a choice is not appropriate to the self's legitimate need to survive. So a couple critical things to look at here, right? Our definition of Yetzer Hara is choosing the self-interest when we don't need to, right? Not to protect when we're in an unsafe situation and we need to make sure we're in a safe situation. It's always important to look out for our safety, but there are many times when our self-interest comes into play, and we really have the ability to look beyond ourselves and look and see what the other needs, and that's really a sort of essential teaching of Musar. And so, sin is when we make the wrong choice in those moments, when we make the choice for the self instead of the other. So just keep that in mind as we look at the next text, which is from the Rambam, and we start reading it through the Musar lens. So the Mishnah Torah has a number of chapters on repentance, and all of them are rich with a lot to study. We could have had that be our whole Elul series, I think. But I wanted to just pick two sections from the Mishnah Torah that I think really highlight some of the steps of doing Teshuva and what that means and what we can sort of reflect on from the CCM perspective. This text, I have to say that when Rabbi Stone mentioned that I learned, I first met Rabbi Stone and learned about his approach to Musar in Las Vegas at a rabbinical assembly convention. I'll let you in a little bit more on the secret. But I will say this, that I went to college and got a BA in Jewish studies and went through 4 year-round years of rabbinical school, and I really didn't learn about Musar until after I was an ordained rabbi. It was something that really wasn't at that time part of a classic conservative education. But of course I learned Rambam. That was clearly an important part of the curriculum. And I remember learning this text very early on in my education and thinking, wow, this text really gives us steps that tells us how to do tshuva, right? He seems at the surface to be very clear in terms of what is tshuva. That's one of the things Rambam in the Mishnah Torah is known for, is to really kind of simplify, to take the teachings of the rabbis that sometimes, oftentimes in the Talmud, for example, are arguing with one another and seeming to have different opinions. And Rambam just likes to clarify and kind of get to the heart and the point of what we need to do as Jews. But here, as I said, so at first I thought like, oh, this is pretty clear. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized like I didn't really know how to take these steps. So that's what I'm going to sort of unpack for us with the CCM lens. So when Rambam says that we need to abandon our sin, we need to make sure we don't do it again, we need to have this feeling of regret, and there's something important in Judaism that people sometimes don't even associate with our faith tradition, which is confession, right? What does that mean and what does that look like? It seems very clear, and yet I would say, I'll just speak for myself and say that I really, I didn't have the tools to really enact this teaching of Rambam until I started studying seriously with Rabbi Stone and with CCM. So these are some of the things I want to unpack with you. The second, and by the way, you'll get these slides afterwards, so if you want to look at these texts more closely, you can. The second piece I wanted to share with you is from the 7th chapter on repentance, in which Rambam says that we need to do tshuva not just for these sins that are very clearly heinous kind of sins with a capital S, like fornication, robbery, and theft. But we have to search out our bad character traits, and we have to do tshuva for those traits. And obviously, for any of you who have studied Musar, whether it's with CCM or elsewhere, we know many of these traits we deal with as part of our midah work, right? Looking at when we're lazy, when we're gluttonous, when we pursue honor, who should we be honoring, etc. So I think this is an important piece that, you know, when we think about sin, we don't just think about these very clear capital S sins, but that we think about our character traits. And as I showed you in the earlier definition, we think about those times that we choose self-interest over serving the other. And so, so this text really highlights that this comes not just from CCM, but comes very much from our tradition, and Rambam recognized this was an important part of the Teshuva process. So what I want to do now is take these phrases that I highlighted in green on this slide and on the last slide, and sort of unpack them using our framework, the framework that CCM really has crafted. Rabbi Stone and some of the senior students who have developed really processes and ways in which we can take these teachings of Rambam and from our tradition elsewhere and really enact them in a real way, in the way we live our lives and in our spiritual practice of Musar. So first of all, kind of starting at the end, searching out our bad character traits is really what we do as we start our Musar journey. But it's something we do continually, but it's really a kind of a central starting place, which is why I put it at the beginning, which is that early on when we're learning the midot, when we're learning about Seder, about order, or about patience, or any of the initial midot that we study, the whole idea of studying these character traits is not to self-actualize ourselves and feel good about who we are, although that's a great thing. But really, the midot study is about becoming aware of how our behavior affects other people. So we, you know, the idea of studying the midot and studying them multiple times is that we sort of, each time we kind of go through, we think, well, I'm pretty good at Seder, at order, but actually, as I use that lens to think about my day-to-day life and I reflect, again, and this is in the cheshbon, when I reflect on my actions, I come to see that, sometimes when I'm falling down in this character trait, it's not just like, wow, I'm sort of a disorganized person, but I look and see how that midah and how that disorganization affects other people. That's really at the center and at the heart of the way we do our work. Second, we regret sinning, and that I think comes about, again, as we're early on in our practice, we come to sort of recognize these musar moments, these times when we realize we need to stop and really examine, did I handle that situation correctly? Was that interaction, something feel off about that interaction? There's something I regret about it. There's something that doesn't feel right. And I need to really focus in on that. We call, we get this language from Mesilai Sharim and other places. We call this watchfulness, right? We become aware of our behavior. We see when we need to stop and do something different, what we call kibush, when we need to really stop in our tracks and think about taking a different approach. And third, we specify the sin, right? We recognize, and this is really critical to our approach, and this whole notion of sin being choosing self-interest over the other, is that we really, we take a moment and we see not just how our action may have affected another person, but we really stop and we realize and we turn away from ourselves and turn to the other person, and we see when we may not have borne their burden or served them in whatever burden they may have. And so that's really at the heart of when we talk about specifying the sin. I think it's naming that and naming the fact that we're not seeing another person, we're not hearing them, we're not really recognizing, we're too self-absorbed to really see what the other person is needing at any given moment. Herb, should I pause there or should I keep going on to the next slide? Oops.
Okay, so no, I think a question has come up that would be worth entertaining at this point, which is When is it okay to choose the self? When is it okay? When does it make sense to prioritize the self rather than the other in our approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's something that we spend a lot of time on in the first number of months of practicing and starting our practice of Musar. I'll try to give a simple answer, but I think there's probably a more complex answer as well. The simple answer is that, as I mentioned before, that if we're in a situation where we feel unsafe, where we really are going to be hurt, where we're threatened in a real way, we obviously need, and our tradition has a very strong sense of pikuach nefesh, right? We're obligated to take care of ourselves, to make sure we're in a safe situation, to keep ourselves alive and healthy and all of those things. But one of the things that happens early on in the practice is that we recognize that we oftentimes think that we may be in an unsafe situation, but when we look a little bit closer, we realize, like, actually I'm okay in this moment. Like, I had a reaction. We have these sort of fearful reactions that comes after sort of years of having the same behavior and a history of how we've reacted to certain things over time, and past hurts that cause us to have an initial kind of reaction. And what we learn to do in Musar is to really be more reflective and to not react quickly, but to give ourselves the time to really sort out, is this a moment that I really need to protect myself? Or is this a moment where I can be of service to the other and I'm really okay? And so the answer comes with time and working on the practice and really being able to pause and make that determination.
Great, thanks. Let's go on to your next slide.
Okay. So on this slide, at the top of the slide is probably what I find to be the most powerful part of our practice, which is, and I mentioned before that Rambam talks about confessing out loud, but doesn't really, and actually he gives a little formula in the Mishnah Torah of what you're supposed to say, like a sort of one-line fill-in-the-blank formula. But I think what CCM has developed in our VOD practice, and in having a group of people that were together, on the journey of following this Musar practice, and or with the Chavruta who we meet with, not just to study and prepare for class, but also to process and to think together about what's happening in our lives, and to be able to speak the things that we're recognizing to be our sins. Right, that there's an important step in this process in which just saying it out loud is a critical part of really doing Teshuva. And I think we gain that experience over time. At the beginning, I think for early students, it can be very scary to share and to be vulnerable in that way. But over time, I think those of us who've been doing this practice for a long time, I'll speak for myself, we feel really a sense of this is what I maybe most look forward to in my weekly chavruta, is to be able to look back on my week with somebody who I can really process things with that didn't work out as I wanted them to. Things I said, ways I acted that I really want to talk about with somebody. And the way I describe it to my students is it's very different than talking with your best friend. I'm going to say having coffee. These days we don't get to have coffee with our friends other than over Zoom, but it's very different than going and sort of commiserating and sharing stories. It's not about sharing stories. It's actually really turning to your chavruta or doing the practice in your VOD and saying, I'm not just telling you this story to feel better about myself or to get you to join me in thinking that I made the right call, but actually we confess in the sense that we say, I didn't do this right and I need help to think about how I want to do this differently. I need you to, I need someone who's a sort of a reflective partner, or I need a group that's going to hold me accountable. And that's a big part of the way we do this confession step that I think is really critical. Next, we commit to abandon the sin, as Rambam says, and the language we sort of we use as part of we're going to look at a little piece from Tomer Devora in a little while from one of the other texts we study in CCM, is we say we commit to nourish and sustain, we recommit to nourish and sustain the other, which means we really, abandoning the sin, stepping away from the self-absorption is a step away from the self and towards the other person, and really knowing that what we want to do in our lives is be of service and to help the other bear their burdens. And so to me, that's what the commitment is here, in the way we understand this idea. And finally, another very powerful step is, what Rambam says, that we make sure that we don't return to this sin. This is maybe the most challenging one, because many of us have sort of repeated patterns of the way we've been in the world. And I'll speak for myself and say, oftentimes I'm like, I thought I worked on this. I guess I have to work on it more. But we do this in two ways. The sort of, what I would say maybe the mini step is the step of asking the question at the end of, like, what am I going to do next? So even if I'm not back in this difficult situation yet, maybe that won't happen for a long time. Hopefully it'll never happen, but there's always some next thing I can do to serve the other. And so that's part of our process, is we really think about what's the next thing we can do of service. And then of course we talk about how we would do whatever it is differently in the future. And we use our midot as tools to say, to reflect on, if I'm focused on this midah, if I am really focused on patience in this situation, this is how I will be different, right? So we use the midot as a tool to help us to not return to the sin and to be clear about what our path is forward. I'm going to pause there again, Herb.
Well, Rachel, we got a question that is very relevant, which is, what does skillful bearing of the other's burden look like? And there was a prelude, which is, how does one bear the other's burden without merging with the other's suffering or taking it on in an inappropriate way? So what is a skillful way to do this that you've discovered? Yeah,
I think in my practice, one of the important teachings, and some of this is, I'm going to say, is very, putting these in simple phrases is a very sort of simplified approach. So sort of unpacking it, to me, bearing the burden of the other is not about saying, oh, I know what your burden is, Herb, and when instead of acting the way I was acting, I'm going to do this for you, and sort of and claiming to know everything that's going on in your life and what you need. That's not, for me, that's not bearing the burden of the other, and I don't think that's what our program is encouraging. I think it's really, a lot of it is about really seeing the other person, listening, being open to what they might need, being open to them revealing how we can be of help to them. So it's not about sort of knowing and sort of diving in. To me, it's not about those things. It's really more about the turn away from the self and the turn towards what might open up as an opportunity to be of service to them.
So a follow-up question. When we serve the other, are we also serving God? You mentioned us and the other. Where does God fit into this framework?
Yeah, that one we're going to let Ira delve in deeper, maybe in the final session. But the way in which our program understands it, and the way that makes a lot of sense for me, is this notion as serving every other is part of serving God, right? God is the infinite other. There are endless number of people to serve in the world. Each person is made in the image of God. And so to me, the focus of this practice is really on service of other people. Next week, Rabbi Cameron is going to talk about prayer. And so I think there'll be maybe also some connections made there between service Avodat Hashem, service of God, and service of the other. So he'll probably tie that together too. But for me, it's interconnected. But the focus in the Teshuva practice. And actually, in Rambam, he also talks about, he sort of distinguishes between Teshuva with human beings and with God. So this is more focused on human beings.
More questions are coming in, but I'd like you to get to a few more slides, I think, before I ask them. So. Okay.
So the next part, I want to talk about this notion. We've been talking about the other all the way through, right? That's really the focus of CCM. That's the lens in which we really do the practice. But I want to sort of turn it a little bit and talk about this question of whether we believe in other people doing tshuva, because I think that's an important part of what happens at the high holiday season, as we're sort of sitting in shul, sitting in front of our camera, using the day for reflection, however we might be spending it, right? We both think about ourselves, but I think also it's just a sort of taking stock of our relationships, and those obviously go both ways. And the next text is a text that I came across through some study I was doing through the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. It's a text from Iturei Torah, a collection of Hasidic teachings on the Torah portion. And this text basically, it takes off from the verse in Numbers, talking about after Korach leads his rebellion against Moses. And when that happens, Moses says these interesting words and says that come morning, God will make known who is godly, and who is holy, and will grant access to God, and will grant access to the one God has chosen, right? And so this Hasidic teaching quotes two sections of Talmud, kind of weaves them together in an interesting way, and says that, and kind of comes from this place, reads out of this passage about who in our tradition is sort of seen as the classic rebel, right? Korach, who rebelled against our great teacher Moses, and uses him as an example and says, what does this come to teach us? That if a scholar who has committed an offense at night, if you see a scholar who's committed an offense at night, don't think ill of him during the day, because perhaps he has done tshuva, right? And indeed, Korach was a great scholar, and so were those who followed him and gathered around him. And Moses thought perhaps tonight they will do tshuva. And so that's why it's built on this idea of why does Moses say come morning? Because it's sort of giving the opportunity, opening up the opportunity that by the time the morning comes, right, Korach and others who followed Korach may very well have done tshuva. And I think it's just such a beautiful teaching, because Moses here is inspiring us to say, even those people who we really struggle with, who really we feel like took us to task, or who rebelled against us, or rebelled against what we think is right, we have to sort of open up this possibility that they have done tshuva. This teaching came from a program that's run by Rabbi Jonathan Slater, and he asked, I think, two really wonderful questions that really spoke to me when I studied this text. He asked, what is your sense of the potential of your opponents to do tshuva? These are, I think, good reflection kind of questions for the high holidays or for Elul. And then the question that I think ties it most to our Musar practice, and especially our midah of mitinut, of deliberation, is, does your sense of this differ over time? That is it less in the midst of a confrontation, or does it grow if you wait until morning? And what that points out to me is that what our Musar practice is really teaching us with deliberation, with pausing, is that in a moment, in the moment when someone has done something very offensive, it's very hard to think about them doing tshuva. But what our Musar practice really tries to teach us to do is to, again, not be reactive, to pause, and to open up that possibility in the pause, to really see the potential for the person to change. And I want to build on that maybe with the next slide, and then I'll pause again. this slide talks about one of the texts that we studied together in CCM, further along in the practice, the book called Tomer Devorah by Cordovero. And in Cordovero's work, he really focuses on, he has different kinds of midot, different kinds of steps really, of how, and it really is very much focused on believing in the other's ability to do tshuva, to really see beyond whatever their behavior is. And in the second midah, where he talks about tolerance, he says, what is that involved? What's involved with this? 3 things, right? That we have to continue to nourish and sustain a person, even in the midst of whatever acts that they may be doing, whatever sinful acts they might be doing. The second part, which is a very powerful teaching that Cordovero says, is that we really we see the person, but we see their yetzer hara, or the sin really, even as separate from them. We sort of, the way I imagine it is like, it's like you're sort of, what's the word? Taking, exorcising the sin and sort of putting it to the side, and being able to see the person without the sin, right? So kind of putting the sin aside and seeing all their goodness and their love and the all of what makes them human and lovable, and you see that without whatever the sin is. And then this last piece is the trust part, trust and repentance. So this I think is the way we kind of deal with this issue of whether we believe in other people's doing tshuva, is this issue of trust. And this was what Rabbi Stone and Beulah wrote about in their book, that our aim is to take the long view, right? It's not about, have they apologized yet, right? It's not about counting the days or giving some kind of ultimatum or some kind of timeline, but really cultivating ourselves the ability to let go and give it time, and give them time to do whatever tshuva they need to do on their timetable. And instead, our responsibility, turning back to ourselves, is and it's not so simple, that's why simply is in quotes, but our responsibility is really to continue to nourish and sustain them, right? And to trust that in their timetable, when it's right for them, they will do tshuva, and continuing to believe in that, and hold out the possibility, and sort of not give up hope, I think is part of what's essential in this midah. I'm going to pause there.
Great, Rachel, because we have a number of questions, and some of them relate to this last point, I think. So think about the chavruta relationship. How is one partner supposed to be of service to the other? Let's say they're both sinners at different times, but when you're the sinner and you've, quote, confessed, as you described earlier, what do you see as and you've just come to some language about nourishing and sustaining, which might be part of this. And then a related question was, how do we learn what the other's burden is? So in a chavruta, that's a good place where we practice learning. And then there's a question that may follow from this Tomer Devorah piece that you just shared. How do we develop habits of serving the other? How do we make this habitual? So that was 3 questions, all I think that could come from this, what you've just shared.
Okay. I should have written them down. So
chavruta, how does the chavruta be of service?
Right.
How do we learn what the other's burden is? How do we make this, what we're describing as the Musar practitioners' practice, how does that become habitual?
Okay. So the chavruta piece of being how does that process sort of lead us to be of service one to the other, right? So yes, I think in the moment that over time, and I would say this develops over time in a chavruta relationship. I don't think this is from day one. What happens is we have a whole sort of set of protocols, a way in which we process situations that we know were not right, or situations that I guess Rambam would say we've sinned, when we notice our self-interest getting in the way. And we have a whole sort of process of how we unpack those and steps that we take one by one to kind of to work on those situations. And so we learn that practice first in our VOD with our leader, with our madrich or madricha. We use it also in our journaling practice. I would say we use it sometimes formally and sometimes informally in our chavrutas. So over time, I think over time it becomes less formal, but we know for one another where we want to go, right? We know that our goal is to be of service to the other. Our goal is to really think about whether, we have lots of different metaphors for this, but I'm going to keep it simple and say we know that our goal is to get out of our Yetzer Hara and into our Yetzer Hatov, to shift from focusing on our own self-interest to shifting to our focus on the other. And so what happens is in a chavruta, the sharing is really about the person shares. We also learn in this practice to do a lot of listening and not quickly diving into solve other people's problems. So I think a big part of the chavruta process too is listening to the other person who's trying to sort of process and go through the steps and think about how they're going to work on this. And then the response of the chavruta who's listening is to just ask the questions that guide the person to go through the practice, right? It's not solving each other's problems. It's not telling each other what it is to do. It's holding each other accountable to go through the steps to get to the place where we sort of who believe in this practice know we want to get to. I hope that answers that. And I think, I've been doing this, I meant to look up how many years, 10 years or something like that, long time. I mess up, and I always have things to process with my chavrutas, but I also look forward to the fact that I have a safe person to speak to and kind of work through my thinking and my thought process and the action steps. It's also someone who keeps you accountable when you say, this is what I'm going to do next. Then the next week they could say, did you do that? Did you actually call this person? Or did you apologize? Or did you, what did you say to your child this differently this week than last week? So part of it's also just having that ongoing relationship that keeps you accountable to keeping the practice going.
From your teaching or your own experience, can you give a specific example of how someone really changed through their Musar work?
I think, I don't want to talk about a specific person, but one of the sort of the common themes that I think all of us who have been madrichim say, both about ourselves and about our students, is that spouses or our adult children or our parents come to see like a change in us and express that to us. And I think that that's the most rewarding moment, certainly the most rewarding moment personally, but also as a teacher, when people come back and say, like, I didn't have a really good relationship with this relative or with this person in my life, and this practice has enabled me to sort of to shift and be in a more loving relationship, or to be of service to someone who I really struggled with. So I've seen it. I know other madrichim can speak about it as well. I mean, I've seen it many times, and for myself, my husband jokes around that he knows when I've had a a good Musar class, because I'm a little nicer, or maybe a lot. We'll see. Depends.
Great. Do you want to go to your next?
Well, I was just going to see the other questions. I have only really one more slide, so I want to just make sure I got to the other questions. how do we learn about the other's burden? I think that was the second question, right? And I think the only way to learn of the other's burden is really deep listening, and deep listening over time. And also, I guess I would say the other thing that we learn a lot about in Musar is also like trial and error, in the sense of like, we try something that we think is going to be of service to the other person, and we see how it goes. And if it doesn't go well, then we know we didn't get it yet. And then we try something different. So I think, and again, it's not about labeling the other person's burden and sort of knowing it in some kind of, what would I say? Like some kind of like ownership kind of way. We're not trying to own another person's burden. I think it's really about the kind of listening it takes to try to figure out, what can I do to be helpful for this person? Where is this person asking for help in some way? So that was.
And the final question I gave you before was about how does this become habitual? How does this become a good habit for practice?
I think that's the answer. Yeah, I think we didn't cover this. Maybe it'll be covered in some of the other sessions, but the CCM methodology that's really based on, Salanter and sort of the whole notion of Musar being a practice has lots of different components. So we've talked about the VOD, we've talked about a Chavruta practice, but also, the journaling practice is part of it, studying Torah and like reading it through this lens, taking on mitzvot and really thinking about being proactive. Also, part of it is from the journaling and the processing. A lot of that is sort of reactive in the sense that or not reactive. It's reflective. It's reflective on what we've done, but there's also the notion of really being proactive and thinking about the things that we can do to bring goodness and to be of service. And so all of those kind of together is how it becomes habitual.
So before we get to the last slide, there were a couple of questions about making amends to the person we have harmed. One was about Rambam. Rambam talks about verbal confession, but that's presumably after you've made amends. Someone else asks about if I've gossiped, do I have to return to those others who heard the gossip to correct the impression I conveyed? So what are this? I guess people are interested in Rambam's take on this. If there's any guidance of how to do it. In terms of what you've shared before, that's kind of comes in our next steps after a process. When you think about the next step, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
So the topic of amends.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic, and I will just put it this way. I'm not sure I know exactly what Rambam wanted us to do in that respect. When I think about it through the lens that we think about in Musar, I think it's really important to differentiate whether we're making amends to make ourselves feel better, or if we're really doing it in the service of the other. Because I think sometimes, and that's why I think it's powerful to have the opportunity to do the confession with the Chavruta or with our VOD, because I think there's a lot of situations where going back to the person in a kind of revelatory, let me tell you what I did kind of way can sometimes be more hurtful than actually choosing to think about what good can I do for them. It might make us feel better to kind of get it off our chest, but that's not what it's about. So I think that doesn't mean there aren't, and obviously the 12 steps have very powerful ideas around making amends. I think there are times that are really important to make amends publicly to the person that we've hurt. My understanding in our tradition is that it's about sort of making things right. So I think making things right doesn't have to always be confessional. I think it could be handled in a way that really serves the other, which isn't always confession, like straight out confession.
Thank you for that answer. Let's.
Okay. All right. So I wanted to sort of tie basically these two ideas together about doing tshuva, believing in other people doing tshuva. And I came across a modern text that I must have taught many, many years ago. I found it on an old text sheet that I realized that I just loved seeing it again and relearning it, especially because I didn't know Rabbi Stone's teachings back then. And obviously Rabbi Stone's first book, A Responsible Life, is really, introduced many of us to his teachings, and a lot of people study it in the beginning part of their practice. So what this book by Lawrence Kushner talks about is this word responsible. And I think it really ties together these two ideas very nicely. So he talks about how responsible has these two meanings. One is related to our own actions, our guilt and blame and punishment, right? And being responsible. We did something wrong. We have to take responsibility. And then the other, he says, he calls moral maturity, being a responsible woman, being a responsible person. And he talks about that. I love this. He talks about it, being able to respond, being response and then able. And he says, if you're guilty and you deny it, you're not able to respond. But also there are times when we're not guilty, but we still might be responsible, right? Everyday situations arise which require the action of a responsible person. And I think when Rabbi Stone asked the question of how does Teshuva transform us, I think this is one answer to that question, which is that doing the work of Teshuva, both for ourselves and believing in other people's ability to also do tshuva, is the way in which we grow in our responsibilities as a person. I'm not sure I have an answer more than that, other than I think, this is the trajectory of life is really about taking responsibility for the things that we've done, but also for the world that is created around us and the interactions that we have with other people, even when we're not maybe at fault or the one who has sinned or the one who has been self-absorbed. Even in those moments, we want to bring responsibility into the world. We want to build relationship. I think that's the other piece how does it transform us, is that it really strengthens our relationships, our connections, our ability to connect with people on a soul to soul level. I wanted to close with this just because I think it's a great connection to sort of a core understanding of Musar, helping us to lead a responsible life.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm gonna though keep you answering questions if that's all right.
Sure. You know what? Let me just share my last slide, and then maybe we'll be full screen. I'll take off my slides, and that's just to tell you to stick around next week, because next week Rabbi Cameras is doing tefillah prayer. Okay.
Thank you. So, one of the questions addressed evil that's not between you and somebody, but larger evils out in the world. And I know we've been working on conceptualizing this. What's your take right now on Musar affecting the broader social world?
I think it connects to the last text that I put up, which is that, I think Musar is about each of us taking responsibility. I think as we're doing our cheshbon nefesh for this year, I think many of us are reflecting on our interpersonal relationships, but we're reflecting on a lot of other things as well. I think you can't help but be doing that if you're living in the United States, but in a lot of places. Yeah, I think, I think it's a lot of, I think it's a big question, and I'll leave it to some of our other teachers and maybe Rabbi Stone to reflect on it more. But I think part of the Teshuva process, I think every year, I think that connects back to the Elul, each year has its destiny, is to reflect on what's happening in our, closest circles, closest others, but also to reflect on all the other communities that we're a part of, and to look at those as well.
I get there's something I guess I could say in response, which is stay away from evil, sur meira va'aseh tov, and do good. One of the ways we stay away from evil, isn't it, is to stop the contagion of Yetzer Hara behavior. And we've lived in a very contagious atmosphere politically the last few years. And so I know that some of our teachers have offered classes about how to bring Musar into contemporary political reality. And some madrichim are more drawn in that direction than others. So, and then to be a positive force for change by taking responsibility. So it's stopping the negative behavior when you encounter it, and then being a positive force for change. Then I got a question that I really can't answer, but I think you can, which is, are there times or sins which are in our, that we sort of sinned in our mind and we should just live with them rather than erase them? This reminds me of Chaim Grada's novels. Is it bad to be in a constant tension with things that are more damaging and dangerous to yourself if you're constantly processing it rather than just living with it? It's a difficult question.
That's a difficult question. Again, I think through our lens, the focus is how we can sort of get out of our self-absorption. So I think just sort of processing endlessly and sort of running on a wheel keeps us in self-absorption and unable to see the other.
Great.
But I think that the whole point of having, a protocol that we work through, whether it's in our journaling or our VOD or with the Chavruta, is that we do talk about the things that we think, not just what we've done, and we work on our thoughts, because sometimes we think our thoughts actually aren't actions, but oftentimes our thoughts do certainly impact how we act. And so I would say that maybe both of those things together. One is to kind of keep the wheel going, is not getting us to the other, but also sometimes we do need to think about our thoughts, because our thoughts come out in our actions, even when we don't think that they do.
Indeed. That's great. That if you're actually having a success, what I hear then is if you're having a successful cheshbon process, you're not going to be stuck endlessly regurgitating, endlessly processing, because you're going to have moved forward.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of what the protocol has given us, is that it's given us a way to feel like we're doing the work. Even if we go back and have to do it again, but at least we know we have a path to work to move forward.
That's great. We are at the end of our hour. Thank you so much for your teaching. We really all benefited from the preparation you did and putting yourself out here on the spot to take these questions. We really appreciate it. As you said, next week's we continue the investigation of Unatana Tokef with a program about tefillah, about prayer, from Rabbi Richard Camrus from Los Angeles, who's another one of Rabbi Stone's longtime students. And we're delighted that and hope to see many of you there next week. Please keep your questions coming. It was very lively on my end, trying to relay them all to Rachel. So thank you for all your attention. And tonight is the beginning of Elul, so we wish you a good Elul. And tomorrow morning you can begin blowing the shofar for the wake-up call that is Musar.
Yes.
Thank you.
Chodesh Tov, everybody. Thank
Chodesh
you.
Tov.
Thanks, Herb.